It is a WNBA, Women's National Basketball Association, which means women, which means females, not males who identify otherwise. I wish he would speak out because that would really help everybody else to speak out about it. You know, as I say, courage is contagious.
Would you have beaten anyone in the top 500 men? Top 1,000? What do you think?
Maybe. It's about 500 might be.
I said what I said. I think it's kind of common sense.
The debate over who is allowed to compete in women's sports has moved from courtrooms and legislatures directly onto the floor of WNBA arenas.
I watched the Sophie Cunningham thing play out. And honestly, Martina, I was kind of incredulous that we are still having a situation where a female athlete is vilified, booed, heckled, abused, and ostracized by colleagues simply for stating a biological fact.
It did not start with a press conference or a league statement. It started with a single interview. On July 21, Indiana Fever guard Sophie Cunningham addressed the subject of transgender athletes in an ESPN feature.
It's just sad. I mean, Sophie spoke the truth. She was not singling out trans athletes. She was only talking about male bodies in women's sports, which clearly is not a fair fight. So it is a WNBA, Women's National Basketball Association, which means women, which means females, not males who identify otherwise. So she just spoke her truth, and she did not back away from that. What I find really sad is that she's been vilified for that and called all kinds of names, as I have been as well. But most of all, that the league is not supporting this, that the league is silent.
Her comments were brief and direct. She said she wanted to protect young girls in a locker room or young girls in sport who she believes should not have to compete against biological men. She framed the position as an extension of care rather than exclusion, saying that alongside that care comes a responsibility to be honest. The reaction was immediate. Cunningham received criticism from commentators, fellow athletes, and fans who characterized her comments as hostile toward transgender people. She rejected that characterization directly. She said she had received significant negative feedback accusing her of hating the transgender community and stated plainly that she never said any such thing. In a follow-up statement posted to social media, she wrote that she stands with all people, does not judge based on race, religion, sexual orientation, or gender identity, and hopes everyone can compete fairly. She also described herself as politically centrist, saying she agrees and disagrees with positions on both sides of the broader debate. Despite the backlash, Cunningham did not walk back her original comments. On Instagram, she posted a short response. "I said what I said." She has repeated that she considers the position common sense, and has said the conversation around her comments has overshadowed the basketball itself, which frustrates her. The controversy followed her from arena to arena. She was booed on the road in multiple cities, including during stops in Seattle and Portland. Rallies in support of her position formed outside some of those same arenas. Speaking to reporters after being booed in Portland, Cunningham said she had no intention of hiding her views to placate critics. She said she was there to play basketball, but also there to be herself, and was not going to dim that just because people disagreed with her. The controversy escalated further when the Fever traveled to Minneapolis to face the Minnesota Lynx. Ahead of that game, head coach Cheryl Reeve addressed the subject directly with reporters. She said it was problematic to suggest that transgender athletes are the biggest problem in women's sports, and argued that a segment of the public was turning the issue into a larger cultural fight than it needed to be. She added that she believes protecting transgender kids is fundamentally a human rights issue, though she also acknowledged that the picture becomes more complicated once athletes are past puberty, competing at the Olympic level, or competing for scholarships. During the game itself, Reeve wore a t-shirt reading "Trans Kids Belong" underneath her blazer, visible to the ESPN broadcast. Play-by-play commentary noted she was wearing it in support of transgender kids, and analyst Rebecca Lobo encouraged viewers to listen to what she called Reeve's thoughtful comments from the day before. Cameras also captured Cunningham and Reeve in an animated conversation at midcourt before tip-off. Neither side has detailed exactly what was said, though both later described the exchange as respectful. Reeve told reporters afterward that she and Cunningham both understand they have platforms, that they share some views and differ on others, and that it was valuable to speak in person. Minnesota won the game 108-100. Cunningham finished with 3 points on 1 of 2 shooting, 1 rebound, and 2 assists in 23 minutes. The shirt drew its own wave of commentary. ESPN analyst Stephen A. Smith criticized Reeve's decision to make the statement while coaching against Cunningham's team, calling it, in his words, an irresponsible thing to do for someone leading a women's basketball program. The moment also arrived against a specific legal backdrop. In June, the Supreme Court upheld state-level bans on transgender athletes competing in girls' sports, intensifying national attention on the issue heading into the WNBA season. As for the league itself, the WNBA's current collective bargaining agreement states that only players who are women are eligible to compete, but the agreement does not define the term woman, and there is no publicly available league policy that directly governs transgender or intersex eligibility. As of this reporting, there are no openly transgender players competing in the WNBA. The Fever's handling of media questions on the subject has itself become part of the story. At least one team press conference was cut short after reporters attempted to press Cunningham and her teammates further on the issue, with the session ending abruptly rather than continuing into additional questions. That pattern has left much of the day-to-day burden of addressing the controversy on Cunningham herself, since her coaches and most of her teammates have largely avoided commenting on the record. Cunningham's teammate Caitlin Clark was repeatedly asked to weigh in as the story grew. She consistently declined to take a side. Speaking to reporters, Clark said the subject is not something discussed in the Fever locker room, and that she views eligibility questions as something for leagues and governing bodies to work through with their athletes. She said her focus remains on basketball. That neutrality became its own storyline. Tennis legend Martina Navratilova, an 18-time Grand Slam singles champion who has publicly opposed transgender inclusion in women's sports, criticized Clark's response during an appearance on Piers Morgan Uncensored. Navratilova argued that neutrality was not a realistic option on a question that directly affects the sport itself. She said Clark was trying to stay neutral, but that this was not an outside political issue. It was a basketball issue in the same way it had been a tennis issue, and an issue for every women's sport. She said she wished Clark would speak out, arguing it would give other athletes the confidence to do the same, and added that courage is contagious and should not require courage to state plainly. She drew a direct comparison to Michael Jordan's well-known 1990 explanation for declining to publicly back a Democratic Senate candidate in North Carolina when Jordan said Republicans buy sneakers too. Navratilova described Clark's answer as a similar kind of bailout, calling it a pity. Navratilova extended her criticism beyond Clark to WNBA leadership. Asked what she would want Clark to say if she did speak out, Navratilova said she would most want to hear from WNBA Commissioner Kathy Engelbert directly. She said she wondered whether league leadership privately believes males should be allowed to compete, and argued that because it is a women's league, its leadership should say plainly that the game belongs to women and girls, and that female athletes deserve what she called a fair fight. She pointed to the history of women's exclusion from parts of Olympic competition, noting that women were barred from running the Olympic marathon until 1984 because officials did not believe they were strong enough for the distance, framing that history as part of a longer fight for separate women's competition that she believes is now under threat. Navratilova's broader argument, repeated across her public comments, rests on the idea that sports have always been organized around defined categories, whether by weight class, age, or sex, specifically to keep competition fair. Her position is that once a male-bodied athlete competes in a female category, a female athlete loses a roster spot, a scholarship opportunity, or a podium finish that would otherwise have gone to her. Reeve's own comments, delivered the day before she wore the t-shirt, went further than a single line. She said the sport faces real issues to address, starting with what she called a responsibility to protect transgender kids, framing it as a human rights matter that applies to every child regardless of gender identity. She then acknowledged that the picture changes once athletes move past adolescence, since questions involving Olympic qualification and college scholarships introduce competitive stakes that are not present in youth sports. That distinction between youth participation and elite-level competition has become one of the more consistent dividing lines in the broader debate, with even some critics of blanket inclusion policies agreeing that the two levels of sport may call for different answers. Not everyone in the sport agrees with that framing. Former U.S. women's national team star Megan Rapinoe addressed the debate directly during an appearance on ABC's The View. She argued that concern for women's sports was being used selectively as what she called a wedge issue by people she said were not previously invested in women's athletics. She said the effort amounts to an attack on women more broadly, arguing that opponents of transgender inclusion are effectively policing how women are allowed to look while claiming to protect them. She pushed back on the idea that young girls face safety risks from transgender peers, asking directly who those girls were supposed to be unsafe from. She also argued that restricting participation ultimately works against all women, saying sports build confidence and power in women and that limiting who gets to play undermines that. In a separate interview on her own podcast, Rapinoe went further, saying the language used to justify exclusion frames trans girls as though they are somehow different from their peers, when in her view they are simply young girls being excluded from youth sports. The tennis world has run its own version of this debate in parallel. World number 1 Aryna Sabalenka voiced support for the WTA's new eligibility policy, which requires a one-time genetic screening for the SRY gene administered through a cheek swab or blood test to confirm biological sex for tour eligibility. Sabalenka said she believes it is important to preserve fairness on tour, arguing that men are biologically stronger than women and that competing against a biological male would not be fair to a woman who has trained her whole life to reach the top of the sport. She said she supports the policy and is willing to be tested herself. The WTA has said the screening is intended to preserve the integrity of women's professional tennis, while stating there is no intent to disrespect any player's gender identity. The policy has drawn criticism from some current and former players, including Billie Jean King, who has called sex-based exclusion discriminatory, as well as from scientists who argue that SRY testing alone does not fully capture the complexity of biological sex development. Commentary from other sports figures has continued to shape the conversation. Stephen A. Smith has argued publicly that supporting transgender individuals broadly and supporting sex-based eligibility rules in sports are not mutually exclusive positions, framing the defense of a female competition category as a pro-woman stance rather than an attack on transgender people. That framing echoes arguments made by Navratilova and Cunningham, who have both said their position is about preserving fairness for female athletes rather than expressing hostility toward transgender people. Supporters of restricting eligibility to biological females have also pointed to physical performance data to argue their case. Advocates including Navratilova have cited statistics from track and field showing that a large number of competitive teenage boys have posted faster sprint times than the fastest recorded times by any woman, arguing that the gap reflects basic physiological differences in muscle mass, bone density, and lung capacity built up during male puberty, rather than differences in training or dedication. Similar physical advantage arguments have circulated using an often cited, though not independently verified in this report, account of a professional women's national soccer team losing a practice match against a youth boys academy team. These statistics and anecdotes are widely repeated in the broader eligibility debate, though the specific figures should be treated as commonly cited claims rather than confirmed data points. The controversy has also touched ownership ranks. A Seattle Storm co-owner was suspended for 5 games by the league after allegedly directing profanity at young fans who were holding signs in support of Cunningham and women's sports, an incident that added another layer to a season already dominated by the eligibility debate. During her appearance on The View, Rapinoe also pointed to a specific source she believes is driving the broader campaign. She referenced a report published on July 8 by the Heritage Foundation, criticizing how enforcement of Title IX, the 1972 civil rights law covering equal opportunity in education and athletics, has evolved over time. In her view, groups like that one are using concern for young female athletes as an entry point into a wider set of policy goals, rather than treating athlete safety as the central issue on its own. Cunningham, for her part, has tied her position directly to Title IX rather than to any outside political organization, arguing that the law's protections are the reason women's sports exist at the level they do today, and that those protections depend on maintaining separate competition for female athletes. Sabalenka's position on this subject did not begin with the WTA's testing policy. She addressed the topic months earlier, in December of last year, during her own appearance on Piers Morgan's program, where she was promoting an exhibition match against men's player Nick Kyrgios. Asked directly about transgender athletes, she called it a tricky question, said she has nothing against transgender people personally, but said she believes a transgender woman would hold a significant physical advantage over a biological woman, and that facing that advantage would not be fair to a female competitor who has spent her career working toward the top of the sport. Kyrgios, appearing alongside her, said he agreed with her position. When the WTA's genetic screening policy formally took effect the following year, Navratilova publicly defended it as well, responding on social media to a fan who said she was ashamed of the organization and stood with what she described as all women who play tennis, transgender or not. Navratilova replied that the WTA supports all women, specifying that she meant female athletes. Clark's specific answer, delivered after the loss in Minneapolis, has been replayed widely since. She told reporters that the subject is not really a discussion that comes up in the Fever locker room, and that she views it as a matter for leagues and governing bodies to work through directly with their athletes, adding again that her own focus stays on basketball. That answer has drawn criticism from some commentators who argue that Clark's platform gives her outsized influence on the conversation regardless of whether she chooses to use it, and support from others who argue that a 24-year-old player should not be expected to settle a policy question that leagues, courts, and governing bodies themselves have not resolved. The dispute over physical performance data has also drawn a response from the scientist most closely associated with the genetic marker at the center of the WTA's new testing policy. David Sinclair, the researcher credited with discovering the SRY gene on the Y chromosome in 1990, has argued publicly that using SRY presence alone to determine eligibility oversimplifies biological sex. He has said the test only confirms whether the gene is present, not how it has functioned in an individual's development, whether testes formed, whether testosterone was produced, or whether that testosterone was usable by the body. His criticism reflects a broader scientific pushback against treating a single genetic marker as a complete stand-in for the full picture of an athlete's physiology, even as sports organizations increasingly adopt it as a practical eligibility standard. Coco Gauff and other prominent tennis players have also faced questions on the subject as the controversy has spread beyond basketball, underscoring how quickly a single WNBA interview turned into a cross-sport conversation involving multiple leagues, players, and governing bodies within the space of a few weeks. The wider Olympic movement has already begun moving toward the kind of standard Sabalenka and Navratilova have endorsed. The International Olympic Committee has adopted a one-time SRY gene screening requirement for women's events beginning with the 2028 Los Angeles Games, with IOC President Kirsty Coventry stating that allowing biological males to compete against women would be both unfair and, in some sports, unsafe. That decision at the Olympic level has added weight to the argument that individual leagues like the WNBA and organizations like the WTA are not acting in isolation, but are instead responding to a broader shift already underway across international sport. Legal scrutiny has followed a similar path at the state level. In Texas, the state attorney general opened an investigation into the state's tennis association over questions about whether biological male athletes had been allowed to compete in women's tournaments without proper notice to opponents, a case still working through the review process as the broader national conversation continues. Where all of this leaves the WNBA specifically remains unresolved. The league has not issued a policy statement addressing transgender eligibility beyond the existing language in its collective bargaining agreement, restricting competition to women, and it has not clarified how that term would be applied if the question were ever tested by an actual player. Commissioner Kathy Engelbert has not addressed the Cunningham-Reeve exchange directly in public remarks, leaving the league notably quiet on a topic that has otherwise involved a Grand Slam champion, a World Cup winner, a sitting head coach, and the sport's most recognizable current player. What began as a single answer in a magazine feature has since pulled in a tennis legend, a two-time World Cup champion, the top-ranked woman in tennis, one of the WNBA's most prominent broadcasters, and the league's biggest active star, each offering a different answer to the same question. Sophie Cunningham has not changed her position. Cheryl Reeve has not changed hers. Caitlin Clark has continued to direct the question back to the league office. And the WNBA itself, without a published policy defining eligibility beyond its existing requirement that only women may compete, has yet to say anything at all.